They may be watching you, but I'm watching them. This is Gabriel Custodiet. Just to let you know that the episode you're about to listen to is going to be great, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. If you're new to privacy or looking for a clear vision of next steps, start by going to escapethetechnocracy.com. All our cutting-edge analysis about escaping the surveillance grid occurs exclusively on our paid newsletter, Watchman's Torch, and in our world-class video tutorials. This podcast is just a preview. This is not some game for us. We live this stuff and we consult on it. Your support means we have no sponsors and can speak the unmitigated truth as we see it on this show. Check out the show notes and escapethetechnocracy.com. I am very pleased today to be joined by Gregory Treat. And Mr. Treat is he's a lawyer, but he's also a consultant, and his company is Avalon Circle, and the website is avaloncircle.com. And Mr. Treat talks about things like dynasty planning, estate planning. So he talks about legal things, but in a very broad philosophical way as well. So Mr. Treat, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
And before we get into some of the maybe more philosophical or abstract stuff, maybe you could just tell people who are listening, maybe they're kind of interested in working with you, let's say, what exactly is the kind of work you do, like just very practical stuff that you do for people?
Yeah, so I'm licensed in Texas. So in Texas, I do kind of ordinary estate planning, wills, trusts, powers of attorney, all of the normal indicia that you'd expect from an estate planner. But I also have a consulting business where I help family-owned businesses across the country develop an understanding of what is their calling, what is the strategic insight that their family has into some part of our world, some industry, some territory, some space that they are generally uniquely gifted in, which is another way of saying gifted is that they have a competitive advantage in. So I help people identify their callings and their giftings, their strategic insights, and their competitive advantages. And then we allow those pillars, those core principles to drive the products that we work with in terms of legacy and things of that nature. Many people who have some success in life and in business will have the experience of having been invited to a legacy event, right? Usually a financial advisor. And really what's happening there is you're being sold products, stereotypically insurance products. It's not always insurance, guys. But that's not what I'm interested in. And I think that there is much better solutions that you can come to if you identify, hey, what is it that drives this family in a long-term way? Because if you're trying to fit the family into a product that you have, that may not be the best solution for them. So that's how I would explain what I do, and I really enjoy it.
I guess we'll throw in here, this is not legal advice. We are discussing sort of legal related things, but it's not legal advice, and Gregory Treat's not your lawyer. Can you help people outside of Texas in any way?
Yeah. So again, the consulting practice is I tend to work with the family's existing tax and legal professionals to, especially for families that have a long-term view. You know, American culture is kind of famous for having a very short-term view. There's a significant section of the population that thinks the world's going to end in the next 7 years. And even the ones that don't have that as like a theological base tend to really approach things in terms of 5-year plans. They're not planning for decades and generations and centuries. And so if you can do that planning, if you have that kind of long-term vision of, wow, what my family has created is a good thing, and we want that good thing to continue on the earth even after all of the people in the room have passed on, then one of the things I clarify for people is there's nothing illegal about wanting that. And there's in fact many advantages to pursuing those kinds of long-term goals. But it is very different from the standard off-the-shelf solutions and templates. And you probably don't know the right words to help your legal and tax professionals know, hey, I'm interested in and willing to work at something that's very different from, let's call it the baseline American culture. So yeah, I work all over the countries, again, partnering with the existing tax and legal team for these business owning families to make sure that they're getting the best possible outcomes.
I think it's worth saying that I met Mr. Treat in person recently. He seems like a very good guy. If and when I'm interested in such topics, I would certainly feel comfortable reaching out to him about it. So, Greg, maybe let's start here. I listened to some of your other interviews, and you have this, seems like a kind of a Batman origin story in a way where The system devastated your family in a way, and it kind of led you. It seems to me on the trajectory that you went into. If you're comfortable, you could explain. Doesn't have to be in too much detail. What happened to your own family that set you out on this path, and especially some of the things like zoning, rezoning, county politics that can really mess people up if they don't have the right mindset and the right planning.
Yeah, so I was the fourth generation son of a dairy farming family in Northern California. I was growing up in the early 90s. And if you know anything about the politics of California for these past, 30, 40 years, being a small family ag operation in Northern California was not what you would call a good strategic position. We'd been there for a very long time, but the demographics of the county that we were in changed dramatically in the late 70s and early 80s. And by the late 80s, just what had been an overwhelmingly agricultural rural county was now almost entirely urbanized. And the people that were there did not see the need or see the value for my family's business, and they really made life difficult for us to the point where my grandfather shut down the operations of the ranch when I was 6. And then it took us, I think, 11 years. My grandfather, I believe, signed the final papers to transfer the ranch when I was about 17 years old. And so my whole childhood composed of us losing the land by inches. And then again, as I'm on the brink of being old enough to receive an inheritance, that inheritance is taken away from our family, and that affected me in a really deep and profound way. Until that happened, I had no idea how good I had it. That old saw of you never know how much you love things until they're gone, right? But having lost that, I was left with a powerful sense that there was kind of forces that were going out and were taking inheritances away from families. One of the things that happened was near the end, my family had been trying to get the family land rezoned as just we'd given up. We were trying to get out. And so we were finally willing to say, okay, we'll just get it rezoned as suburban lots and we'll sell it to a developer. And by that point in time, some people that were very unhappy with my grandfather had gotten political control, and they just kept denying his requests. And then after 4 or 5 years of that, the state decided, so we had ag land that we could not use for any profitable ag purpose because the regulations that the county had imposed after urbanization, especially after we shut the ranch operations down, made it just impossible to make any money in ag. But we couldn't rezone it and sell it, right? They wouldn't let us rezone it and sell it. And so then, after a certain period of time, the state actually said, well, you've been submitting the zoning request for so many years. We're going to assess your property taxes as though that request had already been granted. So instead of, taxes on 364 ag acres, we received an assessment for, 1,400 something suburban lots, right? It was a massive tax bill in the millions of dollars, as I recall. And my grandfather finally got kind of some high level lawyers involved. And within about 6 months, they had incorporated a local town and gotten the jurisdiction zoning of that town drawn around us. We were about 10 miles north of the town proper. But they reached out and grabbed us, and then they had the power to rezone. And then within a very short period of time, they dealt with the tax burden, and then we had sold it. And so that was, as a 17-year-old kid, I'm in my 30s now, and I have a much better understanding of the way the world works. But as a 17-year-old kid, I had this moment of wow, if only we had these lawyers back when I was 6 and we first, shut the ranch operations down, maybe we could have kept the ranch operations going, and then this whole thing could have gone a different way. And, as I said, I'm older now, and I appreciate more than I did as a child the forces that were arrayed against my grandfather and my family keeping that land. But I got to tell you, if we could have kept ranch operations going, I still think maybe it could have gone a different way. So as you might imagine, that left me with just a very powerful sense of motivation for helping other families not lose their inheritances.
And I was thinking, like, obviously you've gone in a path where you're trying to help people so that this kind of thing doesn't happen to them. And I wonder if you were to go, let's say able to go back in time, advising generations of your family, I'm just curious, what are some things that you would advise them on that could have potentially prevented this sort of thing? And this will lead us kind of into the creative work that you do.
The big insight was that you need to not have all of your eggs in one basket, right? You need to have the operating businesses of the family owned by individual people, right, who are working them, and that was what my family had. But you also need a family trust, a family LLC, some kind of family entity that's separate from the individual debts and liabilities of the family, so that if you have a setback, you have this safe account, this safe place from which you can be recapitalized. Like my family, basically everything they had was in that land, and it was very difficult for them to weather. They couldn't handle losing it, right? And when we lost the land, it really destroyed in many ways my family's sense of identity, and was very, personally traumatizing, I would say, to many members of my family, even to this day. My sisters and my brother, it affected them in different ways, and me as well. I joke that I went into politics, and so my coping mechanism was more socially acceptable than those of my siblings. But I'm not saying it was morally better, just more socially acceptable. Really think that having that separation of, here is the business properties, and the business properties are where we make money, and then over here we want to have in a separate box, owned in a different way, the family homestead, the family seat. So I grew up on this amazing manor house with a large farmhouse, and then an attached apartment library thing, and then there was a fence kind of around that inner manor space, and then there were a dozen hands houses and barns and shops and all these things, and the architecture really taught us lessons about how the land, how the organization of the ranch works. So, for instance, the foreman's house was half in and half out of the inner manor. And so that the fastest way to get from the hands houses to the big house was to walk through the foreman's house. And it sort of symbolized his organizational position in our structure, which was a very powerful thing. Unfortunately, that beautiful family identity creating space was all owned by the same, legal structures that own the ranch. And so when we lost the ranch, we lost that as well. We were not able to hold on to it. So I think having a recognition that the business that provides your annual cash flow needs to be legally, it could all be one piece of property, but you want that to be legally separate from the places that you raise your family and train your kids and have these kind of important human development pieces, right? Because training kids is a process of years and decades, not a thing of quarterly financial returns and cash flow.
So you're really good at, I've listened to some of your other talks, you're really good at explaining, kind of explicating the problem that American society is in right now, where it's heavily slanted towards a kind of a perverse sense of individualism versus something that is versus family, let's say. And that's kind of one of the things that you do, is you help people to set up the legal structures, but also understand at a philosophical level how the family can benefit. So I wonder if you could just share a few thoughts on, family purpose versus, let's say, individual purpose.
Yeah, I think that we tell a story here in the West that, you're born and the story starts with you, and you're the main character and you're the protagonist, and you're going to grow up and you're going to leave your family and go on some great grand hero's journey and be totally transformed, in fact, unrecognizable perhaps, to the family who raised you, and you're going to come back, and that's a fulfilling, self-actualized life. Okay. And I just want to state for the record that is a very new story. Okay. That is a very new cultural frame in the West. For most of Western history, the goal was to remain in a place working on the same kinds of businesses that your parents worked on. Obviously, things change from time to time in terms of how you monetize, but the principles of business and the people you did it with would stay the same. And the goal of your life was to stay in lifelong virtuous relationship with your parents and your uncles and your extended family, and to really operate as one larger family unit. And we forget this. There's a famous political thinker, Burke, who talks about family. Family are little platoons. So, I mean, it varies depending on which organization, but never less than 20 and frequently as many as 50. And the reason for that is that a platoon is the unit size that you send out to take a territory and build a semi-permanent base from which you're going to launch other operations. So you need enough people to build this, more permanent camp, provide security, set up a mess, and have all of the things, a radio room, all the things that you need to operate as a place from which you're going to conduct operations. Okay, as opposed to like a squad level where you're taking, you show up and you set camp, but then when you go out and do something, you have to break camp and leave. Okay, and so when Burke talks about these little platoons, he's talking about a group of people that's much larger than what we think of as a family, right? Mother and father and 2.17 kids or 1.7 kids or something of that nature. I can't keep up with how few children you're supposed to have in this. I have 6, by the way. So this concept of family being a unit, and a unit that holds territory over a longer haul, is a critical piece that we are just missing in the modern context. And what I want to emphasize is that this is just a really new thing that kind of came over our culture in the convulsions of the 20th century. And there's a lot of ways of looking at it and saying, man, we've run this experiment for 100 years, give or take, and it really just hasn't worked out very well. Most people are happier when they live in close relationship with their extended family, and they have that family support structure that provides, assistance when you're sick, childcare help, help with wisdom and making decisions in business and who you go into deals with, ultimately some kind of financing assistance. These are the things that family used to do, and everyone seems happier even today when family does those functions. But we've totally undermined kind of the cultural frameworks that used to make that typical and normative. Now the normative idea is, well, you leave your parents' home at 18 and you are never again in any kind of significant relationship, economically, socially, philosophically, with your parents ever again. And that's a terribly sad start to a story that's often quite tragic. I mean, if your story is limited to the arc of your life and you don't accomplish any great things, and you have sort of the normal amount of trouble come upon you, well, that's not a very good story. But if your story can go before you were born, with the parents who loved you and loved each other and had dreams and missions that they passed on to you and gave you resources for, and if that story can continue on to the children that you reach for, right, and resource, that's a better story, and one that I think people really enjoy more. So I highly commend it. That is the good life in my way of thinking, is to live surrounded by your family.
Right. And people might think that, hey, I'm super individualistic, et cetera. I don't want to be constrained by anything. But, there's an element of discipline to being able to have freedom. And the basic example is, if you're a freedom-minded person, but you don't have discipline in what you eat and your body, well, you're not going to have as many options to use your freedom. And so maybe you think about the family in that way as well, which is that if you have that structure, if you have the financial situation, if you have the resources, the network, all these sorts of things, it can help you in your own personal ambitions, much more so than if you went out on your own.
I mean, I know you're in the privacy kind of open source world. One of the things that people are always asking is, well, how do I know that I can trust the technology that I'm using, right? And people will respond to that by saying, well, you should compile the software yourself. And the reality is that's just not realistic for a whole lot of people. About 49 out of 50 people, that's not a realistic thing for them to do. So that's interesting, right? 1 out of 50. That means one person out of a platoon is statistically going to have the skills and drive and availability to, build up the stack from the level of compiling their own software. And if that means that if we had organizations, communities, families, tribes, clans, you can call them a bunch of different things, right? I'm not hung up on the names that I use. But if you have that group, that 20 to 50 group, wow, there's a lot of things that you can get in much higher quality than we're used to kind of in our modern, McDonald's box society.
Moving then to what the kind of the logical next steps, thinking about things like inheritance. Inheritance is, as you've explicated on other occasions, it's kind of designed perversely these days. And if we think about Dynasty, which is something that you talk about, a big part of that is thinking about incentives of inheritance. Maybe you could tell a contrasting story, maybe or two, about how these particular incentives can lead to a successful dynasty or not.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the basic idea of incentives is, and I have to say this, frequently when I'm talking to people, incentives really do work, right? Incentives are the most predictable way of getting people to do what we want them to do, or what the incentives communicate to them that they should do. And the problem is that we frequently mess up the incentives, very, very frequently. And we don't think about what we're doing as an incentive structure. But you take the standard inheritance distribution in this country, everything equally to my children when I die. Okay, no conditions, nothing like that. Just everything equally to my children when I die. What does that incentivize your kids to want? Well, for you to die, and being, presumably your kids aren't sociopaths. They're not going to consciously think through, oh, well, this is incentivizing me to want my parents to die. But you think of it, you've built a room. And when your kids walk into that room, they experience an emotion, a desire, a temptation even. They feel the weight of wishing that you would pass away so that they could get this thing. Well, what is a virtuous child going to do when they feel that? Well, they're not going to go in that room anymore, right? They are going to avoid contact with the system that is causing them to experience that emotion, right? By contrast, if you incentivize children to want to communicate with the family, so take the Rothschilds. So the Rothschilds famously give interest-free loans to their children. And this is almost certainly part of a tax strategy. I should mention that they do get the money back. But the terms of that interest-free loan is, well, the kids got to come back every 2 years and tell us what they have learned in their exploits spending the money. And generally, there's kind of like a business or a project component to the uses of the fund. So this person received the money and they went out and they built a business in a particular industry, and they encountered problems and they overcame them, and they tried solutions, and some of the solutions worked and some of the solutions didn't. And they come back every 2 years and they communicate with the family. This is what I'm experiencing. Okay. This is what I'm experiencing. And that's communication. Now, I do consulting work. And when we talk about the 5 levels of family alignment, communication is the most basic level. The most basic level. A lot of families feel like, well, I shouldn't have to incentivize my children to do communication. And maybe you don't. Maybe you've done an incredible job of raising and training your kids. But I'm going to tell you something. Some of the richest, most powerful, most successful families in the world think they have to incentivize communication. Right? And that's something that we should all take seriously in terms of how do we build our structures. And then in general, one of the great things about that structure is because the family money is not particularly tied to any one person dying, it doesn't operate that way for the Rothschilds. Like the Rothschilds essentially have a private, family bank that they can go to for loans and investments and other access to assets when they need them for the business plans that they've proposed, and the trust will give them access to those funds. Okay, And that means that their ability to participate, to play a relational game with the family where they receive resources and then eventually come back with either resources or experience or both, right? We hope for both. But you tend to get a lot more experience when you don't come back with resources. Funny how that works. But the interaction that they have with the family is totally disconnected in terms of money with the death of a particular person. Instead, the family stands in the center of all of the individual members, and it offers basically the same deals. Now, certain kids are going to be more gifted, right? Certain kids are going to prove that they are better at managing money, which means they're going to get more from a rational lender or investor. And their family is a rational lender or investor, otherwise they wouldn't be so powerful after so many years. But that's a totally different incentive structure or way of handling inheritance than we tend to have in kind of the modern American individualistic culture, where I have all the money as the older generation until I pass it on to you, and then I have nothing.
Right. And in on another interview you did, you told the story of a food business that was known for like no antibiotics, no food dyes. And then when the main shareholder did not have a good incentive structure, within 6 months, right, they started putting antibiotics and food dyes. So you're totally right about incentives.
And that's the danger of not having a family, because as I recall, that was the second generation who had been passed this fortune pretty much unrestricted, right? And instead of continuing to pass it on, continuing with the social covenant that had kept his family from engaging in the key point about the antibiotics and the food dyes is this is short-term behavior, right? This is behavior that's maximizing profit over quarters or years rather than decades or generations. And so if you break the social contract, then you make your children into managers with an MBA, just like every other manager with an MBA. And if you incentivize them the same way, you're going to get the same results.
Now, does the concept of dynasty and some of these things that you work through with high net worth individuals, do you think they would also apply to any level to, let's say, Lewis, the W-2 mechanic, and Jessica, the dental hygienist? Or is this more for people who are, on the entrepreneurial path, et cetera?
I think that it's important to decide what you want in life, right? And there are people that what they want is to have a relationship with someone who is going to kind of stand over and shield and protect them, right? And again, this is true for the overwhelming majority of people, even in our individualistic coded society with all of these cultural cues that say, no, you should always strive, to be able to provide for yourself and to stand on your own 2 feet and not to have any dependencies, right? Most humans still want really to have some kind of relationship with a boss, okay? And 1 out of 50, 1 out of 20 maybe people actually have any kind of desire to build in a dynastic way or in a long-term way and to be the kind of the master of their own destinies. Now, the principles apply to everyone, right? Because there's a huge difference between working for someone who is incentivized to build a virtuous system that their kids can participate in on that long-term scale, and a corporation that is just trying to extract as much value as it possibly can from whatever source in the next 3 months, right? There's a better way to live. And so I really encourage people to look for ways to, even if you don't decide you don't want to be that family that kind of stands up, between most humans and God, and is an intermediary and bears that additional risk and that additional pressure, and therefore reaps, when things go well, additional rewards. If that's not for you, then find someone that you trust rationally, and you've made an assessment of their character, and say, okay, I want to place deliberately. I'm going to strive to be useful as this family climbs the ladder, and I'm just going to kind of shelter under their wing, right? So I really do think that if you acknowledge that this is how the world works, that there are families who stabilize different industries and spaces, and you say, well, maybe I want to be that family, and that's great. Discover your calling, discover what it is that you're supposed to take charge of in the world and do that, right? Go take some territory, conquer. But if you're like, I don't really care and I want to do a good job and I want to serve well, find someone with a calling and a purpose that you love. And you're like, wow, that purpose, I could spend the rest of my life working and helping that family achieve what they want to achieve. And that would be a virtuous way for me to make money. That's fine. What I don't recommend is working for the machine, right? Where at some point you're going to be the easiest thing to extract value from. And that suction hose that you're attached to is amazingly good at extracting value. That's not a good place for you. And that's certainly not a good place for your kids or for any kind of generational planning.
Let's just put the rubber to the road for a second. If somebody was listening, they're thinking, wow, this is a really good idea. What exactly would that look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say you need a business that is cash flowing and probably grossing somewhere in the $2 million range. And we've got $500,000 left over, right? Especially if you've got adult children where there's $500,000 left to compensate the family. And this can include the salaries of the family, the salaries of the dad and 2 or 3 kids. So you've got a business that's viable, that's producing, that's cash flowing, that you're doing good. And then you've got a family that's figured out how to make that first generational transition where the kids can come and work for the dad and they understand, wow, this is a good deal and this is a good thing for me. And the business is performing at a level where it is financially a good deal for them. They're not just avoiding some level of hardship out there in the world. Okay. So at that point, you probably have your primary operating business in an S corp, maybe a family, maybe an LLC, but probably an S corp. And then what you're going to do is you're going to set up a second entity, a family LLC, that's going to enter into a relationship with the primary business operation. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, there's a bunch of things that the family does to perpetuate its culture. And to the extent that it's legally permissible, and that's an independent kind of analysis that you got to go through, to the extent that it's legally permissible, we're going to run all of those family culture, leadership building stuff through this secondary LLC. And that's where we're going to really focus. So have you heard the expression, you can work in the business or you can work on the business? So the idea is when you're working in the business, you're actually like generating revenue. You're sitting at the desk, you're making calls, you're closing clients, you're accepting money. Okay. That's working in the business, performing a role. Then, but when you sort of step out of working in the business and making it go, you're thinking about strategy and long-term plans and how do we expand and where are we creating inefficiencies that we need to fix. And that's working on the business. Okay. And so what we want is that family entity where you not just work on the business, but teach your kids to work on the business. Okay. So you already have the business where you've taught them to work in the business. That's great. Now we want a second box where you can say, I want to teach my kids what it means to work on the business and improve it. Okay. Many times there's a intellectual property component to this where we would take, hey, this is the SOPs, the operating procedures of the family. And here's how they get the better than average returns for their industry is by, and it always comes down to people. It always comes down to building relationships with people, taking people that are low cost acquisitions, let's say, and giving them the skills to be much, to be a real value add to your team, where you take someone that doesn't have very much in the way of skills and you actually train them and do the development piece. And that's, big picture, that's one of those things that, again, major corporations are just truly terrible at. The amount of training of the workforce that's done by businesses with 50 people or less employed is overwhelming, staggering, compared to the money that they represent in our economy. You have these massive businesses with these massive budgets, and they are absolutely terrible at training their people. And there are some exceptions for, in particular, let's say the consulting world, McKinsey and these other big consulting firms they tend to be pretty good at training their people. But by and large, a multinational takes people with the skills they have and employs them at that level. And it's really quite difficult for you have to decide to improve yourself in that structure. So having those two pillars in the family, the operating business, and then the family LLC, which is acting as this secure, safe repository and this place where you train, that's how you, that's kind of the very beginning, the seed of a dynastic system. And obviously that can scale up to massive, massive complexity. But those are the two pillars. You have something that cash flows, right? That generates money on a regular basis, preferably monthly. And then you have something, a different box that is pursuing much more long-term goals. And frequently there's a tax benefit to setting the structure up that way. Long-term, that family LLC will own the family seat, right? Because if you're doing life in community with your family, there's going to be times where it's not cost effective for all of the children to have independent, suburban 3-bedroom, 2-bath houses. And so maybe on a temporary basis, maybe on a long-term basis, you're going to want those kids and their families to move into a larger house that the family owns where they can, really interact and help each other through hard times. This is very typical in the event of a divorce or a death or, some business setback where, wow, we need to kind of huddle up in our platoon and make sure that we're all okay and able to recover and then go back out and continue taking territory. So that setting up that secondary entity, that secondary structure to pursue those long-term goals, that's what I would say is kind of the most elemental form.
I wanted to just pick your brain a few questions about trusts. Obviously, trust will be part of everything you're talking about. Trust is a very useful vehicle for all sorts of things. As regards trust, just whether dynasty or not, do you think that everyone should be thinking, we won't say like everybody should have a trust, but should everybody be thinking about how they could use a trust in their life?
I think that everyone should be striving to become the kind of person that could use a trust, which is to say that there's a certain set of mindsets, a certain kind of mental framework that you need in order to use a trust well. Okay, if you have the mindset that says, well, yeah, I've got it in this trust and there's some legal paperwork, but really the money is mine, you should not use a trust. That mindset will make you not follow the rules and you will eventually break an important rule and go to jail. Okay. And deserve to, frankly. What you have to do is recognize that a trust is a legal relationship where there's somebody with property and they have a purpose for that property. They have a desire. Generally, they want the property to benefit a specific beneficiary under certain conditions. And then they might have conditions for how it's supposed to be invested and managed in the meantime. But the primary purpose of the trust is to accomplish some goal. Okay. And when you transfer money from your name to the trust, at that event that we were at, that we met at, there was an individual who was talking about his trust structure, and he was basically asked, well, what about your money? And he goes, well, it's not my money anymore, right? I don't own that. And that man was well assisted by counsel. Let's say. So I think that we should all be striving to cultivate that understanding that while we might have control over certain assets, there is a sense in which when you transfer the money into here, it's no longer yours, and you shouldn't think of it as yours. You should think of it as the trust's money or the family's money. Okay, and there needs to be this sense of holiness, of sacredness, that when you touch this money, you should only do it in order to further the purposes of the trust, which are different from your personal wants and desires. Okay, even if you formed the trust, there is a difference between you, the person, with your wants and desires, and the trustee and his duties and responsibilities to the future. And that's really, we should all, I think that exercise is a super important exercise. And in general, there's many financial advisors and kind of people in the faith world that say that their wealth took off when they really started to get the idea, what if this wasn't my money? What if everything that passed through my hands was an entrustment from God or the universe or whatever they believe in, and I am responsible for maximizing what I can get from these resources. And that, for many people, that's part of the story of how they became the exceptional, successful person that they became. And so I think it's a really important thing to be pursuing the mindset that allows you to use trusts properly, because you're going to account for it differently. You're going to spend it differently. You're going to be much more careful and much more documented in your process of your decision making. And again, if you're going to use trust for any kind of significant purpose, that is very much, again, we're not giving legal advice, but that's very much a good idea to be very cautious and very aware of what you're doing when you touch trust assets.
I'm sure people bring you on a regular basis the trust that they currently have, and then you might give some advice one way or the other. Are there common flaws that you regularly find that people have with their trust that they bring to you that simply you think differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most common mistake is sort of the product focused. So you have people that they're doing a legacy structure because it will increase their net wealth. They're doing a legacy structure because it's an efficient tax strategy, rather than having a non-tax business purpose, which is, I'm doing this series of transactions because I have a desire to have an impact on the culture of my family. I want to manage my kids and manage my grandkids to move in a certain direction that they would not otherwise move, most likely. And and as a result of that, there's this tax thing, or there's this increase in wealth that's going to happen, right? But inevitably, the reason why that strategy is famous is because it's attached to a really successful family, and that really successful family had their success not just because they have this particular tool or product. They had it because they kept their family together over decades and generations, and the compounding of the family wealth was what really the success story. So that's the biggest thing that I see is people who have been sold on a financial product or a tax product, and they're good products. I'm not criticizing them. They do what they're advertised to do, as I would say, as they're required to by law. But people frequently get bad outcomes because even if the tax strategy performs as advertised, even if the financial strategy performs as advertised, if you don't have any kids that love you and that love your family and that are interested in continuing the family purpose in 30 years, what does it matter?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It makes me feel bad about the more individualistic question I'm about to ask in a moment. But before that, though, how state specific is a trust?
Obviously, whenever you do a trust, you need a local attorney in the state where you live to advise and assist you with that. A lot of trust has to do with federal taxation. Just a depressing amount of the trust document will probably be related to some form of a tax related issue. And that obviously is the same all the way across the country. Trusts are an old structure. They're part of the common law. They're 400 years older than corporations and partnerships and LLCs and all those kind of the modern limited liability structures. Those all come from the 1600s, and trusts really re-enter the Western legal stream in the 1200s, when noble knights were going off to fight the Crusades and needed to set up something that could provide for their dependents in their absence for decades, or potentially, if they died, for forever. And so it's an older structure that's pretty well established, and there are some regional and state varieties, but for the things that you're doing with trusts, it's not really that different from state to state.
For people who are maybe not yet still thinking about Dynasty, and they're interested in the idea of trusts for, let's say, privacy reasons, right? Unlike LLCs, trusts don't require registration or tax ID number. How do you view trust in terms of, let's say, privacy tool? Because one of the things that is exposed, let's say, is the trustee. I'm just curious how you would go about thinking about that.
So most of the alleged privacy benefits of trusts are actually not about the trust. So a trust is not technically an entity. It's a legal relationship where the trustee takes on all of the obligations of ownership and the beneficiaries get the benefits of ownership. Now, if that trustee is a lawyer, then he has privileged information. He cannot be compelled to disclose information about his client, including, especially if the client sets it up this way, he cannot be compelled to disclose information about the identity of his client. Okay. And so if he's the trustee and he's able to operate on behalf of the trust and do things, then that trustee is acting as your liability meat shield. And he does not have to disclose any of that information. That's the genuine kind of privacy structures of trust that are legally enforceable. Okay. Where if somebody comes knocking and says, I want you to tell me who the beneficiaries of this trust are, an attorney can say they're my clients and you don't get any more information than that. Literally, right? I'm not authorized to disclose confidential client information or privileged client information. And you can make that stick, and you don't have to tell them, right? Unless there's some proof that you are assisting them in the commission of a crime and some other very, very narrow. Well, I mean, in the modern day, those prescriptions are getting more challenged, but it's really, the trust has been used as a way of allowing legal privilege to shield who is owning property and who is benefiting from property. Okay. The other thing is that trusts frequently do not require registration. All right. And so you can operate as a business, do things, and have property that's owned not in your name, right? But that is not, the difference there is that there's no limited liability. Does that make sense? There's no ability for, like, if you do something in that trust, then many of the people involved can be sued. And that's kind of a real difficulty with operating in the trust. And again, if someone comes knocking and they say they serve a subpoena on your trustee or on the people that are the agents of the trust, the people that are doing stuff for you, unless there's a lawyer involved, those people are going to have a really rough time not telling the government or whomever is using the government's reach in terms of a lawsuit, serving discovery requests. You're going to have a really hard time not disclosing that information. Not that it can't be done, but the privacy benefits of trusts in many ways I see as life is very complicated and frequently people can just go under the radar. But there's a difference between operating under the radar and having some legal right to not have your information disclosed.
We'll kind of wind down here. I have a question that doesn't fit into any other category for you, but I'm curious your thoughts. I'm assuming that many, if not most, churches are nonprofits. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Does that mean they have limitations about what they can say from the pulpit, for example, about, let's say, politics and things like this?
So the Constitution, the IRS has for many years maintained that by applying for the 501c3 designation, that churches are entering into, in essence, an agreement with the federal government that limits their right to speak on certain key subjects. Okay. What I'll say is that those limitations have never been really thoroughly tested in court. And I would vigorously contest if I had a client who had a 501c3 church. I would vigorously, and he got in trouble for saying something. We would contest that and just say, hey, the IRS issued these regulations, decades ago, and no court has ever said that this is in any way an appropriate thing for them to do, and y'all can pound sand. However, when you file for a 501c3, you do have to file the 990 every year. Okay, you have to file a tax return that discloses a large amount of financial information. Okay, and there are alternatives to doing that. Namely the 508, which is some people call that the constitutional church. What I'll say about the 508 is you need an actual church structure and purpose to make that a valid use of what you're doing. Okay. If you don't have a true nonprofit purpose, then you can get yourself into enormous trouble using the 508 structures. And there's a lot of people online that will talk about things like faith-based organizations. And they say, well, you can have a 508 faith-based organization. There is no, I think that faith-based organization is drawn from IRS regulations, which the IRS can change at any time, right? Every court case that I'm aware of has said something along the lines of church, the idea of a church or a synagogue predates the United States, and therefore it would be a violation of the free exercise clause or the establishment clause for us to attempt to define a church. But you better have some kind of hard theological reason for your structure, and in Christian terms, this is called polity. You want a document that's really, really old that you're interpreting in some kind of quasi-rational way to say, this is what the structure is, and we didn't come up with it, right? We didn't have a vision and get some kind of authorization from a spirit. We have a text that we're interpreting, and yes, as a practical matter, that sort of benefits Christians, Jews, and Muslims because they're the text-based religions in our country, and it does, and maybe a court will opine on that someday. But right now, all we have is church, that the church is older than the Internal Revenue Code, and the IRS doesn't have the right to require them to file the 990 and comply with some of these things without, in order for them to get their tax exempt status. Okay. So I hope that answers the question on the 501c3 and the 508 and the way that they interact. And even for a church that doesn't want to file the 990, there is a fair bit of risk in not having your status adjudicated, right? Because that means that your status is going to be adjudicated at some point in the future when the IRS or OSHA or whatever organization is kind of taking you to task is mad at you and thinks they have some evidence of your wrongdoing. Okay, and the reality is that if the evidence of your wrongdoing is sufficient, it may impact the judge's willingness to say that you're a valid faith-based organization or a valid church in kind of the moment of decision. So, which is not a reason not to do it, but it's a reason to count that cost very carefully and talk to, again, a lawyer that's licensed in your state about what your options are there. It's not something to be entered into lightly or just as a means of creating privacy. You really do need to have a belief that this is the way that God wants you to structure that part of your life and that part of your spiritual life.
This has been Gregory Treat of Avalon Circle. Greg, I'll give you the final thoughts if we missed anything, and also maybe you can say what kind of clients that you are looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to work with business owning families that have a desire to pass their going concern business to the next generation and have a plan that'll carry their family forward for the next 100 years. And there's a lot of barriers to that in our world, in our culture, and my goal would be, if you have that desire, allow me to help you overcome those barriers. So thank you so much for having me on, and it's been a real pleasure.
Hey, thanks for listening. I could really use your help real quick. If you could share this episode with someone, engage with me, leave a review anywhere. This helps me to break the technocratic shadow banning that is happening with my brand. And of course, if you really want to escape the technocracy, go to escapethetechnocracy.com. Privacy tutorial series, books, newsletters, consulting, and of course, you can leave a donation. Thank you very much.